Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you today about something that every counselor does, and it's facing tension between care and control, empathy and exhaustion, healing and harm. And these aren't signs that we are doing the work wrong. It's part of the work itself. Counseling lives in the space between opposing forces, and how we navigate that tension often determines whether our work helps, harms, or simply holds. I want you to keep that word tension in mind today. It shows up everywhere in our field, between systems and people, between clients and counselors, and even inside ourselves. And I'm using a metaphor to help us explore it. Tabletop role playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Now, even if you've never played, here's the basic idea. The dungeon master doesn't dictate the story, they guide it. The players make choices, face conflict, and learn together. Counseling isn't so different. We don't write the story for our clients, we co create it with them. We use empathy, curiosity, and collaboration to help them see new paths and possibilities. And that's the bridge to motivational interviewing, a practice built on three pillars: collaboration, evocation, and autonomy support. Our goal in this lecture is to look at how motivational interviewing helps us navigate the very real tensions, divisions, and discord that show up in addiction counseling, from the personal to the systemic, and to think about what it means to practice well when things don't neatly align. So here's your readings for this week. We have our two books that we're working from, Undoing Drugs and Motivational Interviewing. And there's some additional optional resources that you can read too if you're really into this concept of tabletop role-playing games. There's some really nice research that's evolving that's showing how much these games can help in therapy. So before we dive in, let's take a look at where we're headed today. Like I said, this module is all about tension, the push and pull between empathy and control, compassion and burnout, and connection and division. We're going to move through these tensions like stages in a campaign, exploring how motivational interviewing helps us navigate discord and build trust, even when things get messy. So here's our path for today. We're going to start with rolling for connection. We'll start by grounding ourselves in the spirit of motivational interviewing for collaboration, evocation, and autonomy, and connect that to the metaphor of tabletop play. Then we're going to name three big tensions that we're working with: systemic, relational, and interpersonal discord, so that we can recognize where each reading fits. We'll move through our 4 chapters from Szalavitz's readings this week alongside motivational interviewing's focus on planting seeds, responding to discord, and practicing well. Each scene highlights some real-world tension, and we'll pause and reflect, use metaphor, and of course, connect it all back to motivational interviewing skills. We'll do a little bit of practice, and then we'll close by thinking about what it means to practice well in a field of contradictions and how to keep rolling for growth, even when discord shows up in our systems, our clients, and ourselves. So grab your metaphorical dice. Empathy is our character class today, and our campaign goal is simple: to understand how tension can become the space where change begins. So I want to name these 3 main arenas where tension tends to show up in our work as counselors. And the first is systemic discord, the kind of tension that exists between people and the larger systems that they have to navigate. This is where we see the clash between institutions, policies, and access to care. Think about things like forced tapers, long wait lists, insurance limits, and the constant tug of war between public safety and human dignity. In Undoing Drugs, Szalavitz writes about this all the time: how systems meant to help can actually create harm. The second arena is relational discord, the space between counselor and client. This is what Miller and Rollnick call those moments when connection wobbles, when we start to feel pushback, resistance, or distance. It's when our intentions and our clients' needs fall out of sync. In those moments, the work isn't about technique, it's about repair. It's about holding curiosity instead of control. And the third arena, the one that we often overlook, is interpersonal discord, the tension that lives inside of us. The gap between who we want to be as helpers and the limits of what we can do, between our empathy and our exhaustion, between our ideals and the systems we have to operate in. This kind of tension can show up as burnout, self-doubt, or frustration. And it's the kind of discord that requires self-compassion and reflective practice, not more striding. So as we move through today's lecture and the readings, I want you to keep these 3 arenas in mind: the system, the relationship, and self. Each story we discuss will touch one, sometimes more than one, of these layers. So as we move through the readings, just notice where each story takes place: in the system, in the relationship, or inside of yourself. Where do you feel the most tension in your own work right now? And what does that tell you about where your growth edge might be? All right, and with that in mind, let's head to our first scene: Undoing Tough Love. So, our first tension today is one that runs deep in the field of addiction counseling, the pull between control and collaboration. In chapter 16, Szalavitz traces the history of what became known as tough love, the idea that if we confront people hard enough, shame them enough, or make them hit rock bottom, they'll finally change. It came from a well intentioned place. Families were desperate to help loved ones and wanted clear rules, structure, and safety. But as Szalavitz shows, those early programs often mirrored the same punishment and disconnection that drive addiction in the first place. She calls out something really crucial. Tough love confuses control with care. The thinking was, if I can make you uncomfortable enough, you'll find the motivation to change. But we know from both research and experience that shame doesn't grow insight, it shuts it down. When people feel attacked or abandoned, the nervous system moves into defense mode, survival mode, and there's no place left for curiosity or learning. And that's where motivational interviewing offers a radically different stance. Instead of forcing readiness, we create the conditions for readiness to emerge. Our guiding question then becomes, do we demand change or create space for it? In motivational interviewing, we do that through empathy, reflection, and affirmation, not through confrontation or coercion. Let's anchor this idea into a metaphor that you can hold on to and think about the tabletop campaigns. A dungeon master who punishes every mistake, who kills off characters for small errors, or mocks them for poor rolls, loses the party. The players stop trusting the story. They stop taking risks. But a dungeon master who treats missteps as learning moments maybe lets the rogue trip a trap, but gives them a chance to recover. That builds trust, and the group learns together. That's what motivational interviewing does for the counseling relationship. It makes the space safe enough for risk, reflection, and repair. In Motivational Interviewing, Chapter 14, Miller and Rollnick describe this as responding to discord. When tension arises in the relationship, the skill isn't to tighten control, it's to soften stance. So let's look at 3 connections between Salavitz's critique and motivational interviewing skills. First, tough love isolates, compassion connects. In both therapy and gaming, people need to feel like they belong before they'll take risks. Compassion doesn't mean permissiveness. It means seeing behavior in context. In motivational interviewing, that's often the role of complex reflections, mirroring not just the words, but the meaning underneath. Second, shame is not motivation. Think about a player who's been publicly scolded for a bad move. Odds are they won't show up next session. Clients are the same. Shame doesn't inspire persistence, it triggers retreat. Here we rely on empathic repair, naming the discord, validating emotion, and re-establishing partnership. And third, connection precedes change. We sometimes treat rapport like the warm-up before real therapy, but connection is the work. A party that trusts each other can face harder quests. Likewise, a client who feels understood can finally look at ambivalence without shutting down. Motivational interviewing reminds us that curiosity and collaboration are stronger motivators than pressure or persuasion. Szalavitz critiques tough love, while motivational interviewing asks us to plant seeds of change through empathy. Take a minute to think about your own counseling experience, maybe even outside of addiction work. How do these 2 approaches feel different in practice? What risks do you see when counselors act like authoritarian dungeon masters, setting traps instead of building trust? And if you were the healer of your own party, what would compassionate care look like for you right now? So keep that image in mind as we move into our next scene, Undoing Pain Care. We're looking at what happens when systems, not just counselors, start confusing discipline for healing. So this next tension brings us into the system, where medicine, policy, and lived experience collide. Salavitz's chapter 17 is hard to read because it captures the real kind of cruelty that hides behind the word policy. She describes people in pain who did everything right, took medication as prescribed, followed the rules, and then found themselves suddenly cut off when opioid restrictions tightened. In trying to fix one crisis, the system created another. The pendulum swung from pain is the 5th vital sign to no opioids for anyone. And patients were left suffering, some turning to street drugs, some taking their own lives. And the harm here isn't just physical, it's relational. It's the feeling of being unheard and distrusted by a system that's supposed to care. That's systemic discord, when the system's rules and the person's reality can't find common ground. And that's where counselors often get stuck, in the middle, translating between policy and pain. In Motivational Interviewing, Chapter 13, Miller and Rollnick call this kind of work planting seeds. When readiness is low or when barriers feel immovable, we don't force change. We create small openings for it. The same philosophy applies for when working with systemic harm. We can't always rewrite the rule book, but we can plant seeds of safety, dignity, and trust in the person sitting across from us. So let's connect this to our metaphor and imagine this through the lens of a campaign. Picture a dungeon master who suddenly bans all healing potions. Maybe last week, a few characters used them too freely, so the dungeon master decides, that's it, no more potions for anyone. What happens next? Players stop exploring. They get cautious, anxious. They start conserving energy instead of taking healthy risks. Trust fades, and the story gets stuck. That's the same energy we see when systems overcorrect. In trying to prevent misuse, they create an environment where people in pain stop asking for help. The motivational interviewing skill that fits here is planting seeds rather than prescribing fixes. Instead of telling somebody, here's what you should do about your pain, you might ask, what's the hardest part of managing it lately? Or what does relief mean to you, physically or emotionally? These questions are open, invitational, and non-judgmental. They start to restore agency. Remember, each client's pain narrative is unique. Everyone has a backstory, not just in Dungeons and Dragons, but in therapy too. What they've survived, how they've learned to cope, how they were taught to interpret suffering, all of that shapes the story they bring to you. Our job isn't to edit the story, it's to understand it. And that's where ethical curiosity comes in. Curiosity is the middle ground between rescuing and withdrawing. It's okay when you gently ask, what are you trying to protect by holding on to this pattern? That question honors autonomy and motivation at the same time. It says, you're the author here, not me. If we think back to our metaphor, this is the moment when the dungeon master steps back and says, it's your turn. Which path do you take? That's not indifference, it's trust. And in counseling, that's autonomy support. In systemic terms, it's dignity. And it's one of the few things that we can reliably offer when the system itself is failing people. Human connection, respect, and belief in their ability to choose. So take a moment and think about this tension, the pull between empathy and boundaries, between caring deeply and staying grounded. When has empathy pulled you too far into rescuing? When have boundaries felt too rigid? If counseling were a campaign, how do you keep your healing spells sustainable? These questions, I don't expect them to have neat answers. They are practice questions, not performance ones. The truth is balancing empathy and boundaries is never static. It's something that we keep recalibrating moment to moment, client to client, system to system. And that's what practicing well really means. Staying present enough to notice when you've drifted too far to one side and being willing to adjust with compassion. So let's take that mindset with us to the next section, where the system's failure has even higher stakes, undoing overdose. This is where Szalavitz's voice hits the most urgent note. She reminds us that overdose isn't just a medical crisis, it is a social fracture. Every overdose death represents isolation, a place where connection broke down. Someone used alone. Someone didn't feel safe enough to call for help. Someone didn't believe anybody would come. And when we respond with punishment instead of care, that fracture deepens. That's the tension that we're sitting with here. Isolation versus connection. Communities heal through cooperation, not control. Szalavitz traces how harm reductionists, often people who use drugs themselves, built grassroots overdose prevention networks long before the system cared to listen. They distributed naloxone, trained peers, and reframed overdose as something preventable, not inevitable. And that's what she means by undoing overdose. It's not just about saving lives in the moment. It's about rebuilding a social fabric where people can be seen, cared for, and kept alive long enough to choose recovery if they want it. So let's unpack this through our metaphor for a minute. Imagine a battle scene in a tabletop campaign. The party takes on a difficult challenge, a dragon, a trap, whatever it is. One of the players goes down. What happens next? The rest of the group scrambles to help. Somebody casts a healing spell. Somebody uses a potion. Someone shields the fallen ally until they can stand again. No one says, well, that's your fault. You should have known better. Because in that moment, the goal isn't judgment, it's survival. And that's the same spirit behind harm reduction. Overdose prevention is community care. It's the belief that everyone deserves another chance to roll the dice. In counseling, it looks like shifting from why did you use to What did using do for you? That's a responding to sustained talk move in motivational interviewing. Instead of arguing against the behavior, we seek to understand its function. Tell me what using gives you before we take it away. That question isn't permissive, it's curious. It says, I trust that this made sense for you in some way at some time. Once that understanding is voiced, clients can start to explore new options without shame closing the door. Another key idea here is peer leadership saves lives. Szalavitz shows how harm reduction movements were led by people who'd lived it, people who'd overdosed, been revived, and came back to train others. That kind of peer care mirrors what strong group work does. It decentralizes authority. In Dungeons and Dragons terms, it's the healer sharing potions instead of hoarding them. Everyone has a role to play in keeping the group alive. In therapy, that's collaborative safety planning. When we talk about overdose prevention or relapse planning, it shouldn't sound like the counselor writing an emergency plan on behalf of the client. It's something built with the client and, when possible, their community. It might include things like, who can you call if you're struggling? Where do you feel safe using if you're not ready to stop? Or who holds your naloxone kit and who's trained to use it? Those are hard, realistic questions, and they come from a place of love, not fear. Collaboration turns prevention into partnership. And finally, let's talk about language. Words matter more than we sometimes admit. Szalavitz notes the shift from calling an event a drug overdose to calling it a drug poisoning. Overdose carries a subtle accusation, like somebody did something wrong. Poisoning tells the truth. Something unsafe entered the body, often without the person's full awareness or choice. It shifts blame from the individual to the system, to the unsafe supply, to the lack of support, the stigma that forced people to hide. In our metaphor, it's the difference between saying, you failed your saving throw, to, you were poisoned by something you couldn't see. Language reframes meaning, and reframing is one of motivational interviewing's quiet superpowers. When we reframe, we don't deny what happened, we change what it means. Instead of, you relapsed again, we might say, you're still reaching for something that helps you feel better. Let's look for a safer way to meet that need. That's harm reduction. That's empathy. And that's how connection begins to undo isolation. Now, as we move into our final sections, let's step out of the treatment room and into the larger world, one that shapes who gets care, who doesn't, and how we talk about addiction in the first place. And this is where tension widens. It's not just between counselor and client anymore, it's between cultures, communities, and systems. Szalavitz calls this chapter Undoing Divisions for a reason. She's pointing to how addiction policy, public opinion, and even the recovery community itself have long been split by ideology: abstinence versus harm reduction, punishment versus compassion, us versus them. She argues that healing won't come from one side winning. It comes from learning to work together across those divides. And that's where metaphor and motivational interviewing meet this conversation beautifully. Because if you think about any good campaign, the strength of the party isn't in their sameness, it's in their differences. So let's start with this idea first. Division kills empathy, curiosity rebuilds it. In the counseling world and in the culture at large, division shows up when we think our perspective is the only right one. It's when a 12-step counselor dismisses harm reduction as enabling. It's when a public health professional looks down on faith-based recovery. It's when the conversation becomes about who's right instead of who's hurting. Motivational interviewing gives us a way to hold curiosity instead of control. When we approach a conversation or a client with curiosity, empathy has a chance to return. Curiosity doesn't mean agreement. It just means staying in contact long enough to understand the function behind someone's stance. Help me understand what recovery means to you. Tell me what makes abstinence feel safest for you and what makes it hard. These are empathy bridges. They make space for nuance and how division begins to soften. Now, the second idea, harm reduction unites across values. Szalavitz points out that harm reduction isn't a rejection of recovery. It's a philosophy that makes recovery possible by keeping people alive, respected, and connected. It's not a political stance, it's a human one. She gives examples of unlikely allies: law enforcement officers carrying naloxone, faith leaders supporting syringe exchanges, parents who once demanded punishment now advocating for compassion. It's a reminder that when we start with shared values, safety, dignity, love, we can collaborate even when we disagree on the details. In a Dungeons and Dragons party, the same thing happens. You have a bard, a rogue, a cleric, all with different motives, abilities, and flaws, but they share one mission: keep each other alive and finish the quest. In our field, our mission is the same: to keep people alive, restore choice, rebuild trust so that the client can finish their quest. Motivational interviewing captures this in its spirit: partnership, acceptance, compassion, and evocation. Partnership reminds us that clients are co-authors, not bystanders. Acceptance means honoring where someone is without judgment. Compassion means caring enough to stay curious. Evocation is believing that wisdom already lives within the person or the community that we're serving. These 4 elements are antidotes to division. They keep the table open, even when not everyone agrees on how to play. And finally, practicing well means reflective leveling. In chapter 15 of Motivational Interviewing, Miller and Rollnick remind us that skill isn't just technique, it's how we show up. It's in the quality of our presence, our humility, and our willingness to learn from mistakes. If you think about that through our tabletop metaphor, a good dungeon master debriefs after every quest. What worked? What didn't? What did I miss? Practicing well is the same kind of self-inquiry. When did I lean too hard on advice giving? When did I pull back when the moment called for courage? When did I mistake compliance for change? Those reflections are our long rest. They restore us for the next session. Because if we're honest, this work is demanding. The divisions we navigate aren't just out there in policy debates. They live in us too. We have our own bias, fatigue, and blind spots. Reflective practice is how we catch them early and how we choose curiosity over cynicism. So let's pause here for a moment of reflection. Both Szalavitz and Miller and Rollnick talk about conflict, one at the societal level and the other at the relational level. How can counselors use motivational interviewing skills to navigate discord, whether it's between themselves and a client or between systems and the people they serve, without deepening divides? And what parallels do you see between party infighting in a campaign and the ideological rifts in addiction care? If you had to roll for empathy, what modifier would you want to improve right now? Listening, patience, humility? This is what it means to practice empathy at scale. It's not just a clinical skill, it is a worldview. The same motivational interviewing principles that repair tension in counseling sessions can also rebuild trust in divided systems and communities. The spirit of motivational interviewing, partnership, acceptance, compassion, evocation, is essentially the art of alliance building. And that's how we move from discord to connection. One relationship, one reflection, one conversation at a time. This final tension lives inside of all of us, between the counselor we want to be and the limits we face every day, between idealism and fatigue, between our love for the work and the exhaustion that comes from holding so much of other people's pain. Practicing well means reconciling that inner discord before it turns into burnout. It's the quiet maintenance work that keeps us effective, ethical, and human. Miller and Rollnick talk about this beautifully in chapter 15. They remind us that motivational interviewing isn't just a set of techniques, it's a way of being. The spirit of motivational interviewing, partnership, compassion, evocation, acceptance, it applies to how we treat ourselves too. And when we start to feel depleted or ineffective, that's our cue not to push harder, but to pause, reflect, and reconnect to what matters. So let's talk about this first idea. Real world practice is messy. No matter how we plan a session, clients don't always follow the script. Policies shift midstream, systems change the rules mid-quest. And that's what every dungeon master learns early on. The campaign map never matches the terrain. You can plan for the forest, but your party might decide to explore the cave instead. Good facilitators and good counselors adapt. Reflective practice is how we stay flexible without losing our footing. It's taking a step back after a hard day and asking, what actually happened in that session? What was I feeling? Where did I show up well? And where did I drift from my values? And that kind of reflection keeps you growing without turning every imperfection into self-criticism. Self-compassion is part of evidence-based practice because the counselor's nervous system is one of the tools in the room. When it's calm, curious, and grounded, change becomes possible. The next tension is burnout risk and the myth of endless stamina. In most adventure stories, heroes push through impossible odds with sheer willpower. But in real life and in helping work, it doesn't work that way. Even heroes need long rests. In Dungeons and Dragons, you can't keep casting spells without restoring your mana. If you try, you fail your rolls, you make mistakes, and you forget your purpose. Counseling is the same. You have to notice your own energy before you run dry. And that means paying attention to small cues, dreading a client session that you used to look forward to, feeling numb instead of empathetic, taking home the residue of everyone else's pain, or even gossip. These are not moral failings. They're early warning signs that your system needs rest, connection, or supervision. Self-care isn't the side quest. It is the main quest that lets you keep playing. And sometimes it might be going for a walk, making art, reading about something unrelated to counseling, or laughing with friends. And then finally, we want to look at ethical humility. In chapter 15, Miller and Rollnick say that practicing well means recognizing how little control we actually have over outcomes, over systems, even over our clients' readiness to change. And that's not defeatism, it's realism. We hold influence, not control. Szalavitz echoes this across her final chapters, that meaningful change comes from compassion, connection, and community, not authority. In our metaphor, ethical humility is what separates great dungeon masters from a controlling one. The wise dungeon master doesn't force the story, they guide it. They listen, they take player feedback seriously, and they recognize when the group needs a break or when a role isn't serving the story anymore. In our world, that's supervision. Supervision is like co-dungeon mastering, sharing leadership and reflection. It's where we debrief, question assumptions, and recalibrate our moral compass. It's also where we remind each other that we're human, that we care deeply without carrying everything. So take a minute to reflect on your own practice. What tension shows up for you most often? Idealism, fatigue, self-doubt, or maybe something else? And what's your current side quest? Maybe it's something that keeps you grounded or reminds you of who you are outside the counseling room. And when was your last long rest? What would it be like to schedule one this week? Or maybe schedule a whole week of rest? Practicing well doesn't mean perfect performance. It means staying present long enough to notice when you're off balance and humble enough to course correct with compassion. It's about remembering the work of healing doesn't just belong to our clients, it includes us. We practice well not by avoiding discord, but by tending to it in the system, in the relationship, in ourselves. So before we close this module, just take a breath and check in with yourself. Where are you at on your map right now? Maybe you're between quests, catching your breath. Maybe you're in the middle of a difficult stretch of terrain. Maybe you're resting at camp, reflecting how far you've come. Wherever you are, you're still in the story. Practicing well means staying connected to that, to the story that you're telling through your work in your life. Because the counselor who knows how to rest, reflect, and reconnect will always find a way back to purpose, even when the path changes. I want to end today with one more metaphor from tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. In tabletop games, session 0 happens before the adventure begins. It's the first meeting where the group sits down to create their world together. Players talk about the kind of story that they want to tell, the tone of the campaign, and the limits that keep everyone safe. For example, what topics are off limits or what type of conflict is comfortable for the group. They agree on shared expectations, clarify consent, and decide how to handle problems if they arise. So think of session 0 as the foundation for trust. It's where everybody gets a voice before the action starts. And a good dungeon master doesn't hand out order. They facilitate the conversation, making sure everyone's boundaries are heard and respected. Once that safety and clarity are established, then the story can unfold. In counseling, we do something very similar, though we rarely name it this way. Our session 0 is the beginning of the therapeutic alliance, that first contact where we discuss expectations, confidentiality, boundaries, and goals. It's where we say things like, here's what I'd like to focus on, but what feels most important to you? These are the choices I see. Which direction makes sense for you right now? That's agenda mapping and collaborative goal setting, both core motivational interviewing skills. And just like a tabletop campaign, this shared power reduces discord before it starts. Clients know what to expect, and more importantly, know that they have agency in the process. When we skip this step, when boundaries or expectations are assumed, clients can feel pushed through treatment rather than invited into it. But when we co-create the map, counseling becomes a shared world. It's no longer my plan for you, it's our plan for us. And that's how we turn a power imbalance into partnership. It's also how we practice harm reduction at a relational level, by building safety through consent, not control. So I want to leave you with this. What would a session 0 look like for your next group or client? How could you set the stage so that everybody knows what safety and collaboration look like in this space? Maybe it's talking openly about what kind of feedback clients prefer. Maybe it's clarifying what happens if somebody misses a session. Maybe it's simply asking, what helps you feel safe here? Every time you do that, you're not just gathering information, you're sending a message. You belong here, your voice matters, and we're in this together. And that's really at the heart of both harm reduction and motivational interviewing, inviting people into a story where healing happens through connection, not control. So the theme of this practice is what Miller and Rollnick call evoking, helping clients find their own voice and their own reasons for change. In motivational interviewing, this is where everything we've talked about, empathy, reflection, and partnership, it all comes together. And it's where you start to hear two voices inside of the client. There's sustained talk, which is the voice that wants to stay the same, and change talk, the voice that's imagining something new. Our job isn't to silence one voice, it's to help the client hear both and make meaning from the tension between them. So let's imagine a story together. You're sitting with a client, or in our metaphor, a reluctant adventurer. They've been through a lot. They've survived, but they're not sure they want to take the next step. They say things like, I've tried that before, it never works. Maybe I'm not the kind of person who can change. Using drugs is the only thing that makes me feel normal. These are examples of sustained talk. They make sense. They reflect pain, fear, and experience. In that moment, how you respond shapes whether the story moves forward or gets stuck. Here's where you get to practice, not through role play, but through reflection. I'll read a few client statements, and I want you to imagine how you might respond, using reflections, affirmations, or open-ended questions. Remember, your goal isn't to convince, it's to evoke, to help them hear their own voice of possibility. So our first statement is, I've been clean before, but it never lasts. So I want you to think about how you could reflect this without judgment or false hope. What affirmation could you use to acknowledge persistence or courage? Our second statement is, honestly, I don't even know why I'm here. My PO said I had to come. Think about what the emotion is underneath that. What might happen if you reflected the sense of frustration and the desire for autonomy? And the third statement, using helps me feel normal. It's like I can actually function. So here we want to consider, what might you say to explore what feeling normal means for them? Or how could you use evocation here? Something like, when you picture a version of yourself that feels normal without using, what does that look like? You can pause the video here and either jot down your response, just say it out loud, or try writing a few different versions, maybe one that's more reflective, one that's more affirming, one that's evocative. And this is how you start tuning your ear for change talk, not by memorizing phrases, but by listening differently. And now take a step back and think about what you noticed while you were practicing that. Which kinds of responses helped the story move forward? Which ones deepened discord or made the conversation feel stuck? And how did empathy or lack of empathy affect the direction of the dialogue? This is your reflection for your personal quest for change talk. Each client interaction will ask you to navigate ambivalence, to notice the parts of a person that want to stay safe and the parts that want to grow. In motivational interviewing, that's not a battle, it's collaboration. And just like any good adventuring party, we don't drag our clients down the road. We walk beside them, listening for what makes them want to keep going. So as you move into your work this week, I encourage you to pay attention to your language. In sessions, in supervision, even in your own self-talk. Notice where you hear sustained talk and where you hear change talk. And ask yourself, am I listening for resistance or am I listening for readiness? That simple shift is often where the real magic of motivational interviewing begins. So as we wrap up, I want to bring us back to the metaphor that we've been weaving in all along. The adventure, the campaign, the shared story. Every campaign faces tension, rival factions, moral choices, hard battles, and the occasional moment of rest by the fire. Counseling is no different. Whether we're navigating systems that don't always make sense, relationships that challenge our patience, or the limits of our own energy or creativity, the work is full of tension and choice. What defines us isn't how perfectly we play the game, but how we respond when things get uncertain. So here's your reflection for this week. Something I'd like for you to sit with or journal about, or maybe just think about. In your counseling practice, where do you encounter the most discord? Is it in systems, those institutional or policy barriers that make care harder than it needs to be? Is it in relationships, the moments of rupture, resistance, or misunderstanding with clients or colleagues? Or is it in yourself, that inner tug of war between who you want to be as a counselor and the realities of your day-to-day work? Take a minute to locate yourself on that map. There's no right answer, and wherever you land, that's part of your practice story. Once you've identified where your biggest discord lives, think about all of the skill that you need to level up to navigate it. Maybe it's patience if you find yourself frustrated with systemic barriers. Maybe it's boundaries if you care deeply but struggle to rest. Maybe it's empathic courage, staying open even when the client's resistance triggers something in you. Whatever it is, name it, because naming it is the first step towards growth. Remember, you're not trying to become somebody new. You're identifying the skills, strength, and wisdom that you already carry and bringing them more fully into your practice. And this is how change actually happens in clients, in systems, and in us. It starts with noticing the discord, naming the tension, and imagining what growth might look like. So just remember this. You are the storyteller and the character, the counselor and the learner, the guide and the traveler. The work of growth isn't about mastering the map. It's about staying curious as the terrain changes. Keep rolling the dice, keep listening deeply, keep practicing well, with compassion, with humility, and with heart. And whatever level you're on right now, it's exactly where you're meant to be. Thanks.